The contents of this podcast may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. 22 veterans a day take their own lives due to the effects of PTSD and depression. If only there was a simple way to reduce that number down to zero. But, like most things in life, it is easier said than done. I believe that in order to conquer a problem, you must first understand it. Welcome back to another episode of The Battle at Home. I'm your host, Alex Sanford. Today I'm going to be talking about the history of PTSD, how it develops, and finally, ways to lower cases in veterans as well as active duty members of the military. There seemingly has always been a time when humans have been in conflict with one another. War is ingrained in our brains, but it was not until the 20th century that the effects of war really could be understood. PTSD could be viewed as an overused term that really does not apply to a lot of people. Because of the recent discovery, I feel like there is a knowledge gap in the understanding of PTSD and depression, especially among people who have served or are currently serving. A graphic made by the Rivers of Recovery showed alarming statistics on just how many people are suffering. It stated that 300,000 people will return from Iraq and Afghanistan with the crippling effects of PTSD. It went even further to say that 2 out of every 3 of them will remain untreated for the rest of their lives. When doing research, it is easy to fumble over different statistics, but this was one I simply could not look past. After seeing this, it got me thinking, what are some common ways soldiers develop PTSD? And the results of that question were quite surprising. On veteran.com, I found an article that was written by a 13-year Air Force veteran named Joe Wallace. Joe also used to be a reporter for the Air Force television news, so he is quite familiar with the events that different military branches have to face. He explains that PTSD does not exclusively come from experiences under heavy combat. In the article, he wrote, "Any trauma may result in PTSD, including sexual assault, sexual harassment, and related issues. 23% of women in the military report sexual assault during their career in uniform." I feel like to most this is a very shocking statistic, based on the conventional way of getting PTSD, but it is another harsh obstacle that some soldiers have to overcome. Joe also explains that getting treatment for PTSD is just not as easy as it sounds. A lot of people who have it second guess their symptoms or simply write them off as something else, out of sight, out of mind type of deal. There is also a misconception that speaking up about mental health will negatively affect the individual's military career. Staff Sergeant Scott Schmidt fell victim to this misconception, which really took a toll on his happiness. In 2016, Scott was stationed at Fort Gordon, located in Georgia, when he became a victim of sexual assault. Embarrassed and scared, he kept his emotions bottled up. He stated, "I felt ashamed and embarrassed. I remember thinking that there was no way that this should have happened," he said. "That is when I decided it did not happen to me. I was going to ignore it. I was never going to talk about it again." After this event, he started to show up for work late, lose motivation, and develop severe symptoms of paranoia. This caused his military career to start tanking, and those around him started to notice. He eventually broke down and shared his story with his commanding officer as well as many others. He tells his story online for everyone to see and hopes that those who are struggling with something similar will see it and get help. The barrier to getting help also affected Corporal Blanco when he was dealing with the traumas of coming back home from a heavy combat zone. Whenever his PTSD symptoms started to rise, he would try and suppress them with alcohol in an attempt to forget what he had experienced. He remained untreated until one night he attempted to take his own life. His loved ones took charge and wanted him to get help. From my research, it is clear that soldiers who get progressively worse would rather have kept it bottled up than have reached out and got the help that they needed. This prompted me to invite my close friend on the podcast so he could give his own experiences in the military so far. I interviewed Private Andrew Hoyt, who is currently serving in the U.S. military. He has a long history of service in the family, and he takes pride for what he does in his country. I brought up the statistics and stories that were mentioned before, and I asked him about the dynamics in the military so far. This is what he had to say.
The cycle before mine, a trainee he wasn't being treated well, and mix of stuff with not being treated well, kind of being secluded, and also like just military in general, being away from his family, being in a stressful environment. And I guess he had enough, and he shot himself in the bay. And so they had to change a bunch of stuff so that we are no longer allowed to bring our weapons into the barracks. We're no longer allowed to be with them 24/7. So every day when we shoot, we have to go and turn them back into the armory, and we have to get pretty much strip searched to make sure that we're not trying to like smuggle ammunition back or anything back into the barracks that could potentially harm us.
After hearing about this, I asked if there was any mental health response from the people in charge.
You'd think that the like people that are in charge would be a little bit more conscious of stuff like that, but based off the reactions from the people that were there, like the leadership that was there in that situation, they really didn't show a lot of remorse. And they could just be like putting on a front because we were in basic training. They were trying to act tough and stuff like that. But like, I feel like when something like that happens, it's not something that you kind of like try and act tough about. You should probably be like, yeah, it sucks, like stuff like that shouldn't happen. If you're not feeling well, you should talk to someone, stuff like that. But they really didn't do that much. They kind of just like breezed over it.
It is such a shame that this particular event was handled in the way that it was. The military is an extremely large entity that handles a lot of people, but when it came down to this situation in particular, more should have been done. In order to compare and contrast, I interviewed another lifelong friend named Private Frankie Renzi, who also serves in the U.S. Army. I gave him the gist of my research and asked him to explain the dynamics of what he has experienced so far. More specifically, I wanted to know if there was any focus on mental health from his commanding officers.
It's always talked about, we usually talk about it once a month-ish. Like, we'll have one big meeting in a conference room and be like, hey, if anybody has any questions, feel free to privately, message me, email me, call me, whatever case may be. Even if you're in the middle of something right now and you're just like, I just need someone to talk to. And just even just listen and not even give their 2 cents in. Somebody's there for you. You're not by yourself.
Thankfully, Frankie has not experienced something similar to Andrew, but it sounds like his people would have handled the situation better. From these 2 interviews, it is clear to see that different areas do things differently. Perhaps if more places adopted the strategies that Frankie's chain of command uses, there would be some positive trends. Because PTSD is a breakthrough disease, it does not have a surefire cure. This can come down to many obstacles which add another layer of complexity. Dr. Garcia has dedicated the last 10 years of his life to studying the effects of PTSD in order to help veterans return to their old selves again. He explains that soldiers go through vigorous training when it comes to preparation for field work and fighting. They are very good at learning and adapting to difficult and stressful situations, but there needs to be some training on how to come back home. Dr. Garcia simulates by putting his patients in situations that can trigger uneasy symptoms of PTSD. He pushes them to start gradually until they are able to go out in public without worrying about a thing. His method has proved to be successful with a number of patients. I believe his particular method, along with a combination of frequent checks done by the military, is a great duo to reduce the number of people who commit suicide because of PTSD. After listening to this episode, my hope is that you are more familiar with PTSD as a whole. It is a problem that has gone on for far too long, and spreading awareness about it is only the first step. Thank you for tuning in to The Battle at Home. I am your host, Alex Sanford, signing off.